Welcome to week 3, lesson 2. In the previous lesson, we delved deeper into flexibility and agility as key constructs of building a resilient supply chain. In this week's lesson, we're going to be focusing on that exact premise. How do we go about building the resilient enterprise? The first step lies in business continuity management. Rooted in IT disaster recovery, business continuity management is existent to ensure that management acts with what we call due diligence, and it starts with the preparation of a continuation or continuity plan. So it's about rehearsing scenarios, undergoing a series of training, and developing and perfecting plans to cope with various eventualities. It requires careful consideration in terms of after the event recovery and during the event key actions that need to take place. In other words, companies have to have a documented process for how they will deal with the risks as and when they occur. One key abbreviation that has permeated risk management theory for the last few years has been the VUCA principle. And the VUCA principle provides an underlying foundation to risk management approaches. And basically, what it means is that with risk management, you need to move from a situation of volatility to vision. In other words, accepting that change and risk exists, moving from uncertainty to understanding through the investments in business intelligence and in your information systems, moving from complexity to clarity through collaboration and effectiveness in your supply chain, and from ambiguity ultimately to agility. And as we know, agility and robustness are key constructs in building the resilient enterprise, both of which lead to flexibility, adaptability in your supply chain. So the VUCA principle is a key principle that has been followed in risk management theory. Of course, there are a number of shortcomings when it comes to risk management. And remember that most risks cannot be completely removed, but rather we can mitigate the negative impacts of such risks. When it comes to decisions involving risk, decision theory and managerial tendencies tell us that there are heavy influences downstream as well as upstream in your supply chain. For example, someone's performance, such as a manager, their performance targets may directly influence their objectivity when it comes to managing risk. It's unlikely to have a single unified attitude to risk within an organization. Some managers may be more uh, risk averse. Some managers may turn a blind eye to it simply in favor of their own performance targets. So, of course, it's often chasing a shifting goalpost when it comes to risk management, but it's about creating a unified approach throughout the organization. The Royal Society set out a different view of risk, where they looked at objective risk through the application of quantitative methods, perceived risk, which they deem to be imprecise and unreliable because it's based on perception, and of course, detriment. So, in the event that you've got an imbalance between objective and perceived risk, your level of detriment or loss or harm would be higher. So, it's about balancing sentiment and feeling with quantitative and scientific methods to objectively measure risk or attempt to measure risk in order to create the most effective risk approach. Scientists contend that wherever you've got people involved, objective and perceived risk become inseparable. You cannot remove one from the other. Remember, risk is not a discrete or objective phenomenon. One person may view risk differently from another person. One person may view risk as an opportunity, while others may view it as a threat or a weakness. So, of course, you have to try and marry the two in terms of objective and perceived risk. The different views around risk management lead to business process engineering and what we call a control perspective, looking at revisiting and re-engineering your processes in such a way to allow you to mitigate your overall risk. And if we apply that to the global view of the supply chain, it illustrates that culturally determined perception of risk can vary greatly from one region to another. I mean, you could evidence that by the rate of entrepreneurship in one region to another, by the rate of risk taking in one region to another. So, hence, the forces of nature demonstrate just how far removed we can get from a controlled environment. The environment in which we operate is anything but controlled. So, therefore, there is a need for what we call holistic approaches. And remember, supply chain management as a function is both integrative and interdisciplinary. So we have to look at how we solve what we call wicked problems. Problems that involve multiple stakeholders, involve multiple solutions, and of course, where one decision may generate waves of consequences. You have to look at it within a evaluative framework, in a measurable framework, where you're looking at it not just from your perspective, but from the perspective of the system. So you have to retain, to some extent, multiple as well as differing perceptions. It makes risk management and risk measurement all that more complex because you've got multiple variables that you need to consider. And of course, it's important for us to consider these variables because we need to be able to understand exactly what's impacting our operations. Now, as we round off this topic, I want to briefly talk about some of the technologies that exist to mitigate security risks, as well as some of the legislative frameworks, both internationally. So, of course, we've got our various control and detection and tracking systems. But in terms of security across the supply chain, you actually have an ISO standard in the form of ISO 28000. ISO 28000 lays out minimum standards to have an internationally secure supply chain. And of course, when it comes to shipping and transportation, there are various initiatives. And you, of course, can read more about it in your textbook. I hope that you have found this micro lecture to be informative and interesting. And please remember to complete the readings in your textbook as well as the journal articles. And please watch the YouTube videos. Thank you, and I will see you in the next micro lecture.